Thank you so much for being here. And I would like to begin by acknowledging my identity as a white settler on the unceded territory of the Lekwungen peoples, as well as the Wasanich, Esquimalt, and Songhees nations. My goal in the next 10 minutes is to get you excited about possibilities for queer remediation through interdisciplinary digital humanities and art history models. I will bring together two interfaces which are cross-temporally connected by traditions of multimodal rhetorical structuring being used to construct, or sometimes to dismember, queer bodies and identities. And I will consider them using a queered version of Dorothy Kim's conceptual model of interaction. The first interface is a website called Queer Art History, and it was created in 2017 by self-identified transgender activist, artist, and Point Foundation scholar Casey Hope. The second is a 13th century manuscript copy of Le Roman de Silence from France, written in the vernacular. These two interfaces may seem disparate at first glance, but as Joanna Drucker writes, multimodal web environments, quote, force cognitive processing across disparate and often unconnected areas of experience and representation. I would add that they can facilitate cognitive processing across areas of representation that are often framed as disparate and unconnected in the mainstream. QueerArtHistory.com is rhetorically structured to document and interpret queer art history and to center lived embodied queer experience. Le Roman de Silence survives in manuscript WLC-LM6, University of Nottingham, and its rhetorical purpose is to make explicit the threat of sodomitical bodies. It is a condemnatory, moralizing narrative that, through guiding text-image relationships, tells the story of someone named Silence. Silence is raised as a man by their parents after the king changes the law so that only sons can inherit, and nature and nurture debate about Silence's gender throughout. While dressing as a man, Silence becomes the subject of the queen's affections. The queen Euphemie is represented herself as the antithesis of the ideal woman. Her behavior spans many of Aquinas' categories of lechery as she resists her marriage, tries to seduce Silence, and this is the image I show you here on the left, and has extramarital sex with a nun who is revealed to be, quote, Euphemie's lover deceiving the king in woman's dress. Kathleen M. Blumrich interprets her as revealing her true sexual orientation through first a covert lesbian attraction to Silence and later an effort to transform her male partner into the feminine shape that she apparently prefers, male partner in air quotes. At the end of the narrative, Silence is made to strip before the king, and her body, made masculine by post-lapsarian nature, is, quote, refinished. This is the scene I show you on the right. Euphemie's threatening body, meanwhile, is subjected to equine quartering alongside her lover, the nun, and this was a commonplace punishment for sodomy in 13th century France. Although very bleak, this narrative is part of the history of how queer bodies have been represented, and narratives of dismemberment continue to touch contemporary lived experiences as we navigate our representations in the media. The Nun, for example, is a 13th century manifestation of a trope addressed in the new documentary about trans representation in media called Disclosure. The reveal of a character dressing in defiance of their, air quotes, presumed sex is framed as a deceit. My question then is, how can these condemnatory representations be understood and how can they be remediated? I will argue that one approach is to build queer cross-temporal relationships to contemporary interpretive interfaces, like queerarthistory.com, in new acts of self-definition through control over the contemporary design of our historical representation. As information interfaces, codices and websites shouldn't be disconnected. Kim argues that the medieval codex was one of the earliest information interfaces, and Drucker describes the graphical features of the book as, quote, a spatially distributed set of graphical codes that provide instructions. The graphical features of WLC-LM6 show an intersection of Arthurian verse romance, judgment texts, allegorical romances, and love debate poems. Michel Bolduc has argued that this impacted the purpose, style, and content of the miniatures, which focus on scenes of discourse in a split from traditional action-focused courtly romance miniatures and instead center the influence of contemporaneous moralizing texts such as The Complaint of Nature by Alain Delille. The miniature of Silence standing in the nude is also referential to the running metaphor in the text about their body being written and rewritten. The miniatures themselves were also instructional guides for reading as they take the place of decorative initials in the manuscript. As a material object, this manuscript has a continuing social life, and it's an extant example of the purposeful rhetorical structuring of interfaces being used as instruments to perpetuate, in the words of Drucker, quote, institutionalized relations of power. It is an act of radical archiving to identify and disrupt this representational narrative of the dismembered, threatening queer body using queer methods. Drucker argues that information visualization is necessarily an act of interpretation and dispels the myth of objective data. Using his design training as a student at California State Polytechnic University of Pomona, Casey was creating a queer interpretation of art historical works. He was also giving his interpretation of queer. In both digital humanities and art history, possibilities for queer theoretical frameworks have been said to mean either queer content or to queer as a verb, meaning more broadly the intersectional disruption of cis-heteronormative hegemony through queer methodologies. Casey engages both definitions. Whether he knew it or not, the methodologies he used on the website are themselves part of a long tradition of rhetorical structuring using list-like formats. The use of lists by lesbian historiographers has been taken up by Constance Crompton and Michelle Schwartz, who write that such structuring of data is a valuable mode of self-definition as it allows for, quote, authenticating by accumulation. Casey wanted to visualize a reality of queer existence in art history. He wrote, "My ultimate goal for each and every visitor here to this growing resource is to just gain even an ounce of knowledge in knowing that queer history dates back to those BCE dates you learned in history class and beyond those modern, white, male-centered, cisgender gay pride movements you may have read about." His methodology was also based on the idea of collectivity, which is used by other radical archiving projects, such as the Lesbian History Archive in New York and the Lesbian and Gay Liberation in Canada project, to include a variety of queer lives. This approach creates a collection that can embrace the fluidity of identities without excluding in the present or anachronistically projecting contemporary categories on the past. These methodologies answer the call of the authors of Towards a Queer Digital Humanities to ground conceptual work in the lived experiences of queer, quote, communities, histories, and struggles. By queering the conceptual model of Dorothy Kim, we might further answer their call to develop a queer praxis that is distinguished from mainstream digital humanities by its conceptual models, and queer Drucker's call for, quote, subject-oriented interface theory. This queered model also presents one mode of remediating le roman de silence. Kim writes about pleasure and digital remediation. In relation to the former, she says pleasure is central in organizing and producing in digital humanities, and she argues for transparency about editorial bodies. Casey ensured transparency in the centering of contemporary queer experience. He included a self-description at the bottom of the homepage, and he created a gallery for featuring submissions by contemporary queer makers. When I took on the site this year, I also wrote an introduction beneath Casey's, and I made an Our Founder page to preserve his legacy and maintain transparency about queer art history's origins. Our pleasure in creating this digital collection, and our goal in creating pleasure for queer subjects, is transparent on the site. But what does it mean to center queer pleasure? Kim argues that both the codex and the digital interface are spaces of mediation, building on Drucker's argument that the experiences of individual embodied persons will produce a unique performance of the environment. Kim rejects one-way theories of the gaze, and instead proposes interfaces are sites of intra-action, where new meaning is made that did not precede the moment of interaction between subject and interface. When queered, this model has profound implications for self-definition. Drucker defines human subjectivity as being able to, quote, register a trace of itself in a representation system, and that self-recognition and self-constitution depend on that trace. However, on mainstream interfaces, those traces can be harder to register for some than for others. Through queer rhetorical structuring of our digital environments, we can strive to create moments of queer, pleasurable interaction for ourselves and our audiences by presuming and centering a queer subject. We can also queer embodied experiences in our conceptual models by recognizing the performance they produce will be dependent on their lived knowledge as queer individuals. This is how we can remediate condemnatory works like the copy of Le Roman de Silence found in WLC LM6. As I write this presentation, a book has just been published called The Story of Silence. It is a textual remediation that reclaims Le Roman de Silence for queer audiences by centering the interpretation of silence as a transgender man. Interpretations of this premodern interface allow for multifaceted intersectional self-definition, and pleasure can be created from its indeterminacy. By queering Kim's model and honoring the methodologies of queer historiographers who have come before us, we can tell a queer art history through acts of remediation and self-definition. What are the conceptual implications, do you think, of having a dyke and a transgender man center their pleasurable interaction and self-constitution in the archiving of representations like those of eupheme and of silence? Thank you so much.